The eviction notice trembled in Sarah's dirt-stained hands as she stood in the doorway of the century-old farmhouse that had been her home for 15 years. Her in-laws, the Hendersons, waited smugly by their black SUV, watching as the sheriff forced her and her 3 young children off the only land they'd ever known. "You never belonged here anyway," her mother-in-law spat, clutching legal documents that somehow transferred ownership of the 500-acre farm to the Henderson family trust. What the Hendersons didn't know was that Sarah Chen hadn't always been a simple farmer's wife. Before she met her late husband David, before she traded her corporate suits for overalls, Sarah had been one of Manhattan's most ruthless real estate lawyers. She'd walked away from that world to raise her family in peace, burying her razor-sharp legal mind beneath years of harvest seasons and school fundraisers. But as Sarah loaded her confused children into their rusted pickup truck, she caught sight of the geological survey trucks already rolling onto her property. The Hendersons had discovered something beneath her soil, something worth killing for. "Mommy, why are we leaving?" 8-year-old Emma pressed her face against the window, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her twin brother Jake clutched his baseball glove, the one his father had given him before the accident 6 months ago. 12-year-old Marcus sat in sullen silence, old enough to understand they were being thrown out, but too young to comprehend why. "We're going on an adventure," Sarah managed, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her chest. She'd perfected that tone during countless depositions, never letting opposing counsel see her sweat. The skill hadn't abandoned her, even after years of disuse. Sheriff Reynolds approached the driver's window, his expression apologetic but firm. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm sorry about this. The paperwork appears to be in order. You have 24 hours to collect your personal belongings." "My name is Sarah Chen," she corrected quietly, noting how quickly they'd erased her identity along with her rights. "It's been Chen since my husband died." The sheriff's face reddened. "Of course. My apologies." In the rearview mirror, Sarah watched Eleanor Henderson directing workers like a general commanding troops. The woman's silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her designer clothes completely out of place against the rural backdrop. Her husband Frank stood beside her, checking his Rolex with obvious impatience. They'd planned this perfectly. David's unexpected death in that farming accident had left Sarah vulnerable, drowning in grief, and struggling to keep the farm operational. She'd trusted the Hendersons when they offered to help with the legal paperwork to ensure the children's inheritance was protected. What a fool she'd been. Sarah started the truck's engine, the familiar rumble doing nothing to calm her nerves. As they drove down the gravel driveway for what might be the last time, she caught a glimpse of the survey trucks positioning themselves near the old oak grove where David was buried. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Where are we going to live?" Marcus finally spoke, his voice cracking with the weight of responsibility he felt as the man of the family. "The motel in town, for now." Sarah had exactly $437 in her checking account and a maxed-out credit card. The Hendersons had been thorough in their financial strangulation, somehow gaining access to David's insurance money and the farm's accounts. She'd been too trusting, too broken by loss, to question their sudden involvement in her affairs. But trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. At the Sunset Motel, Sarah settled her children into the cramped room with its faded wallpaper and questionable stains. She turned on the television to distract them and stepped outside to make a phone call she'd never thought she'd make again. Blackwood and Associates, Miranda speaking. Sarah closed her eyes, transporting herself back 15 years to her corner office overlooking Central Park. "Miranda, it's Sarah Chen. I need to speak with James Blackwood immediately." A pause. "Sarah? Oh my God, we heard about David. I'm so sorry for your loss. Are you—" "I need my files from the Meridian case. All of them." "And Miranda? Tell James that Sarah Chen is back and she's done playing nice." The geological surveys made sense now. The Meridian case had involved rare earth minerals, the kind that could turn worthless farmland into a billion-dollar gold mine. Sarah had spent 3 years of her life learning everything there was to know about geological assessments and mineral rights. The Hendersons had made one crucial mistake. They assumed the grieving widow was helpless, that 15 years of farm life had softened her completely. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Sarah looked back at the motel room where her children waited, their entire world shattered by greed and manipulation. The mother in her wanted to hold them close and promise everything would be okay. The lawyer in her wanted blood. For the first time since David's funeral, Sarah Chen smiled. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wheat fields as Sarah Chen Morrison walked the property lines she'd helped tend for 15 years. Each step felt different now, weighted with the knowledge that someone wanted to steal this land from under her feet. The manila envelope from yesterday crinkled in her jacket pocket, its contents burned into her memory. She paused at the old oak tree, where she and David had carved their initials during their 2nd year of marriage. Her fingers traced the weathered bark, remembering how he'd laughed when she'd produced a professional-grade knife from her purse that day. "Where did you learn to handle a blade like that?" he'd asked, and she'd deflected with a joke about cooking classes. Now she wished she'd told him the truth. The sound of gravel crunching under tires pulled her from the memory. A black BMW wound up the dirt road toward the farmhouse, expensive, out of place, and undoubtedly carrying bad news. Sarah quickened her pace, cutting across the field to intercept whoever was about to disturb her children's morning routine. Margaret Morrison stepped out of the passenger side, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. David's mother had never approved of the marriage, viewing Sarah as an outsider who'd somehow ensnared her precious son. Behind the wheel sat Thomas Morrison, David's older brother, his lawyer's smile already in place. "Sarah, dear," Margaret called out, her voice carrying that particular brand of false sweetness Sarah had learned to recognize as dangerous. "We need to talk." "About what?" Sarah kept her distance, noting how Thomas positioned himself to block the path back to the house. Old instincts stirred, reading body language and tactical positioning like a language she'd hoped never to speak again. Thomas pulled out his own manila envelope, thicker than the one she'd received, about David's estate. There seemed to be some irregularities in the documentation. The will was filed properly. "I have copies." Sarah's voice remained steady, but her muscles tensed. Through the farmhouse window, she could see Emma helping Jake with his breakfast. Normal life continuing, unaware of the storm gathering outside. "Yes, but that will was superseded," Margaret said, stepping closer. "David signed new documents 3 months before his death, documents that properly reflect the family's wishes regarding the Morrison family land." The phrase hit Sarah like a physical blow. Morrison family land. Not their home, not David's legacy to his children, but property that belonged to the blood relatives. She thought of the surveyor's report hidden in her bedroom safe, land worth $12 million due to the Interstate Development Project. Enough money to make people do terrible things. That's impossible. David would have told me. Thomas opened his envelope and withdrew a sheaf of legal documents. "He was protecting you, Sarah. The truth is, this farm was never meant to leave the Morrison name. These new documents establish a proper trust, with Margaret as executor and myself as trustee. You and the children will be provided for, of course, but the land itself returns to family control." Sarah scanned the papers he held out, her trained eye catching details others would miss. The signatures looked right, but the paper quality was slightly off. The notary stamp's alignment was fractionally askew. Professional forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. "I'll need to have my attorney review these," she said carefully. "Of course," Thomas smiled, but his eyes remained cold. Though I should mention that the estate's current legal bills are substantial. David's medical expenses, outstanding debts, various complications. If this drags through probate court, I'm afraid there won't be much left for anyone." The threat was politely wrapped but unmistakable. "Fight us, and we'll bleed the estate dry with legal fees." Sarah had seen this playbook before, in a different life, when powerful people thought they could intimidate their way to what they wanted. "How long do I have to consider this?" "We need an answer by Friday," Margaret said. "The development company is expecting a resolution to move forward with their plans." So they knew about the interstate project. Sarah wondered how long they'd been planning this, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. David's death had simply provided the opportunity they needed. "I'll be in touch," Sarah said, stepping back toward the house. As the BMW pulled away, she remained in the yard until the dust settled. Then she walked to the barn and climbed into the hayloft, retrieving a waterproof case hidden beneath old hay bales. Inside lay items she hadn't touched in 16 years, untraceable phones, cash in multiple currencies, and a passport bearing the name Susan Chen. She stared at the photo of her younger self. Harder eyes, shorter hair, no wedding ring. That woman had possessed skills Sarah Morrison had tried to forget. But as she watched her children through the kitchen window, laughing over their cereal bowls, she realized some skills were like riding a bicycle. You never really forgot how to fight back. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Sarah spread its contents across her kitchen table. Bank statements, property deeds, and correspondence painted a picture that made her stomach turn. The morning light streaming through her curtains seemed to mock the darkness of what she was discovering. Marcus had borrowed against the farm 3 times in the past 2 years. Each loan carried his father-in-law's signature as CO signer, and each had been secured without her knowledge. The total debt exceeded $400,000. "How did I not see this?" she whispered to the empty room, but even as she asked, she knew. Marcus had handled all the financial paperwork, claiming it was one less burden for her to carry. She'd been grateful then, trusting in the gentle man who'd given her a new life away from the chaos of her past. Her phone buzzed. Robert Henley's name appeared on the screen. "Sarah, I hope you're considering our offer seriously. The debt service alone will bankrupt you within 6 months." She set the phone aside without answering and continued reading. The correspondence between Marcus and his family revealed a different story than the one Robert had told her. Marcus hadn't been a willing participant in their scheme. The letters showed increasing desperation as he tried to find ways to pay back money his father had loaned him without authorization, using forged documents. The final letter, dated just 2 weeks before Marcus died, was from him to his father. "I won't let you steal from my wife and children. I've found another way to handle this debt. Sarah will never lose this farm." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee mug, finding it empty. Marcus had been trying to protect her. The question now was what solution he'd found and whether it had died with him. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see Sheriff's Deputy Tom Martinez standing on her porch, hat in hand. She'd known Tom since high school, back when she'd been Sarah Chen, before she'd learned to disappear into shadows and read people's intentions in the space between their words. "Morning, Sarah. Sorry to bother you so early." Tom's expression was carefully neutral, the kind she recognized from her old life when law enforcement was trying not to spook a target. "What can I help you with, Tom?" "Robert Henley filed a complaint yesterday. Says you threatened him when he came to discuss some business matters." Sarah kept her face perfectly calm, though inside she felt the familiar sharpening of instincts she'd hoped never to need again. "Robert came here with papers claiming I owed his family money. I told him I'd look into it before making any decisions. I'm not sure how that constitutes a threat." Tom shifted his weight. "He mentioned you seemed different, more aggressive than usual, said it made him uncomfortable." "I buried my husband 6 weeks ago, Tom. A man shows up trying to take my home away from my children. How exactly should I have reacted?" "You're right, and I told him as much." Tom's shoulders relaxed slightly. "But, Sarah, if there are financial issues, there are legal ways to handle them. Don't let grief push you into making choices you'll regret." After Tom left, Sarah returned to the kitchen table and the evidence of her husband's family's betrayal. She pulled out her laptop and began searching property records, cross-referencing the information with what she'd found in the envelope. 2 hours later, the full scope of the scheme became clear. The Henley family had been systematically acquiring farmland throughout the county for the past 5 years, often through suspicious circumstances. 3 other widows had lost their properties after their husbands died with similar debts. In each case, Robert Henley had appeared as the sympathetic family friend, offering to help, only to foreclose when the women couldn't meet impossible payment terms. Sarah's farm wasn't just valuable for its agricultural potential. Recent geological surveys suggested significant mineral deposits beneath the soil, the kind of deposits that could make someone very wealthy if they could acquire the land cheaply enough. She closed the laptop and walked to the window overlooking the fields where her children would play after school. Emma and Jake deserved to grow up here, to inherit something more than their mother's complicated past and their father's debts. In her bedroom closet, behind winter coats and storage boxes, Sarah found the lockbox she hadn't opened in 8 years. Inside, wrapped in black cloth, lay reminders of who she'd been before becoming a farmer's wife. A prepaid phone with encrypted contacts, documentation for 3 different identities, and skills that had kept her alive in a world where trust was currency and betrayal meant death. She'd promised Marcus she would never go back to that life. But Marcus was gone, and his family had made the choice for her. Sarah Chen was going to remind the Henley family why she'd been so good at making problems disappear. The morning mist clung to the fields like a shroud as Sarah walked the perimeter of her property, her boots leaving dark prints in the dew-soaked earth. She'd been awake since 3, her mind churning through possibilities and half-formed plans. The manila folder from yesterday's confrontation with Richard lay open on her kitchen table, its contents spread across the worn wood like evidence at a crime scene, which in many ways it was. She paused at the old fence line where her land met the Hendricks property. The posts here were weathered but solid, driven deep by her grandfather's hands 60 years ago. Every acre beyond this fence represented 3 generations of backbreaking work, of dreams planted in soil and watered with sweat. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very family she'd married into was now trying to uproot everything her bloodline had built. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Found something. Can you meet at the diner in town? 1 hour? Sarah looked back toward the house where Emma and Jake would be getting ready for school. Normal routines in an increasingly abnormal world. She'd managed to keep the worst of it from them so far, but that wouldn't last much longer. Children had a way of sensing when their universe was shifting beneath their feet. The Sunrise Diner occupied a corner lot on Main Street, its chrome exterior reflecting the grey October sky. Sarah found Marcus in a back booth, a laptop open beside his untouched coffee. His usually pristine appearance was rumpled, suggesting he'd been up most of the night. "Tell me you have good news," she said, sliding into the opposite seat. Marcus glanced around the nearly empty diner before leaning forward. "I found the shell company, Meridian Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware 6 months ago, but here's the interesting part. The timing coincides with Michael's first hospital admission." Sarah's stomach tightened. Michael's cancer diagnosis had come 8 months ago, but he'd been hospitalized for complications 6 months back. She remembered Richard visiting frequently during that period, always hovering near Michael's bedside with papers and earnest conversations about getting affairs in order. "They were planning this while he was dying," she said, the words tasting bitter. "Gets worse. I traced the LLC's registered agent to a law firm in Wilmington. Want to guess who's been paying their retainer fees? Richard. Richard, Catherine, and David. They've been coordinating this for months. The forged documents, the shell company, even the timing of when they'd move against you. It's all calculated." Sarah stared out the diner window at the town square where she'd brought the children for summer festivals, where Michael had proposed to her 7 years ago beneath the old oak tree. Everything familiar suddenly felt foreign, contaminated by the knowledge of how thoroughly she'd been betrayed. "There's more," Marcus continued. "The property assessment they're using values your land at $12 million. But I had a contact run comparable sales, and with the new highway development plan for next year, you're looking at closer to $20 million. $20 million. The number felt surreal, like play money in a game she'd never agreed to join. She thought of Emma needing braces, of Jake's college fund that never seemed to grow fast enough, of the tractor that needed repairs and the roof that leaked every winter. All this time, she'd been sitting on a fortune while counting every penny. "Can we prove the documents are forged?" Marcus nodded. "I've got a handwriting expert lined up, and the notary's stamp is suspicious. But Sarah, even with proof, this is going to be a fight. They have resources, connections. Richard's law firm has represented half the judges in this county at some point." The bell above the diner door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see Catherine Henley entering with another woman she didn't recognize. Catherine's eyes met hers across the restaurant, and instead of the guilt or embarrassment Sarah might have expected, she saw only cold calculation. Catherine approached their table with predatory confidence. "Sarah, dear, how are you holding up?" "Cut the act, Catherine. I know what you're doing." The older woman's smile never wavered. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, though I did hear through the grapevine that you've been asking questions about family matters. Word of advice, sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." Marcus started to speak, but Sarah placed a hand on his arm. Something in Catherine's tone, in the deliberate choice of meeting location, felt like a test, like Catherine wanted to gauge her reaction, measure her resolve. "You know what I learned about sleeping dogs," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "They're usually just pretending to sleep, waiting for the right moment to bite." Catherine's smile flickered for just an instant. "Enjoy your breakfast, dear." As Catherine walked away, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. The helpless widow act had served its purpose, but that woman was gone now. In her place sat someone harder, someone who remembered skills she'd spent years trying to forget. The war for her children's future was about to begin. The morning fog clung to the valley like a shroud as Sarah made her way to the old equipment shed behind the barn. Her boots quelched through mud still soft from yesterday's rain, each step deliberate and measured. She hadn't been to this particular building in 3 years, not since she'd helped Thomas store what he'd called seasonal equipment in the back corner, covered by moldy tarps that smelled of diesel and neglect. The padlock was exactly where she remembered it, rusted but functional. Her fingers worked the combination automatically, 0847, Tommy's birthday. The metal clicked open with surprising ease. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of weak sunlight, filtering through grimy windows. Sarah moved past the legitimate farm equipment, a broken cultivator, boxes of irrigation parts, coils of wire fencing toward the far wall. The tarps were undisturbed, covered in 3 years of accumulated grime and spider webs. She pulled away the first tarp, revealing a workbench she'd built herself during those careful months when she'd been preparing for a life she'd hoped never to need again. The second tarp concealed something that made her chest tighten with familiar weight, a gun safe, small but solid, its digital lock still functional despite the years of neglect. Her birthday this time, 1129. The safe opened with a soft electronic beep. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay pieces of her former self, a Glock 19, field-stripped and meticulously maintained, 2 spare magazines, a small collection of surveillance equipment that looked primitive now but had served her well once upon a time, and at the bottom, a manila envelope containing documents she'd hoped never to touch again. Sarah assembled the pistol with muscle memory that unsettled her. Her hands moved independently of conscious thought, checking the action, testing the trigger pull, loading a magazine with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. The weight felt both foreign and familiar in her palm, a ghost limb suddenly reattached. The documents were what she really needed, though. Credit cards under carefully maintained identities. Contact information for people who existed in the spaces between official worlds. Bank account numbers that led to funds she'd set aside for emergencies, exactly like this one. She photographed each document with her phone, then returned everything to the safe except one burner phone and a single credit card. The identity was solid, Emma Richardson, a freelance journalist with an excellent credit rating and a completely fabricated but thoroughly documented history. Back at the house, she found Annie in the kitchen, mechanically eating cereal while staring at her laptop screen. The girl looked up as Sarah entered, her eyes still red-rimmed from crying. "The funeral home called," Annie said quietly. "They want to discuss payment arrangements." Sarah nodded, filing that information away with everything else she needed to handle. "I'll take care of it." "Mom, the lawyer yesterday, what he said about Dad's family, is it true?" The question hung between them like a blade. Sarah sat across from her daughter, studying the young woman's face, Thomas's eyes, but her own stubborn jawline. Annie deserved honesty, but not the whole truth. Not yet. "Your father's family never approved of our marriage," Sarah said carefully. "They thought he could have done better. When he inherited your grandfather's land, they believed it should have stayed in their hands. But Dad left everything to us, didn't he?" "He tried to." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Annie's hand. "Sometimes people find ways around what someone intended. So what do we do?" The question Sarah had been asking herself since yesterday. What did they do? The old Sarah, the one whose hands still remembered the weight of a loaded weapon, knew exactly what to do. But that woman had supposedly died in a car accident outside Phoenix 8 years ago, replaced by a farmer's wife who baked pies for church fundraisers and worried about crop rotation schedules. "We fight back," Sarah said simply. Something in her tone made Annie look up sharply. For a moment, her daughter's expression shifted, as if she was seeing a stranger wearing her mother's face. Sarah forced herself to smile, to soften the edges that had crept back into her voice. "Legally, I mean," she amended. "We find a better lawyer. We make sure your father's wishes are honored." Annie nodded slowly, but her eyes remained uncertain. "Okay, what can I do to help?" "Keep being strong. Take care of your brother. Let me handle the complicated stuff." After Annie left for her part-time job at the feed store, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen and activated the burner phone. The number she dialed was one she'd memorized years ago, but never expected to use again. It rang 3 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Marcus, it's Phoenix," she said, using the code name that felt like ash in her mouth. A long pause. Then, "Jesus Christ, Sarah. We heard you were dead." "I was. But I'm back." The rain drummed against the farmhouse windows as Sarah sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by boxes of documents she'd retrieved from the old barn. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened each folder, revealing the careful records her late husband had kept hidden from her. Bank statements, property assessments, correspondence with lawyers, all painting a picture of a family conspiracy that stretched back years. Marcus had known. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her husband had discovered his family's plans to contest the will long before his death, and he'd been preparing to fight them. The last entry in his personal journal, dated just 2 weeks before the accident, made her blood run cold. "They think Sarah doesn't know what she's capable of. They're wrong. If anything happens to me, she'll need to remember who she used to be." Sarah closed the journal and walked to the window, watching the storm clouds gather over the fields that now legally belonged to the Holbrook family trust, at least according to the fraudulent documents they'd managed to push through probate court. Her reflection stared back at her, and for a moment she saw not the grieving widow and mother she'd become, but the woman she'd been 15 years ago, the woman who could disappear into a crowd, who could read people's intentions in the space between their words, who could make problems vanish without a trace. The sound of tires crunching on gravel made her step back from the window. Through the rain, she could make out the headlights of an expensive sedan pulling up her driveway. At this hour, past 10 o'clock, no visitor brought good news. Richard Holbrook emerged from the driver's seat, his silver hair plastered to his head by the downpour. Marcus's uncle had always been the family politician, the smooth talker who could charm his way out of any situation. Behind him stepped a younger man Sarah didn't recognize. Broad shoulders, careful movements, the kind of person Richard would hire when charm wasn't enough. Sarah quickly gathered the documents and locked them in the old safe Marcus had installed behind their wedding photo. She'd memorized enough for now. By the time the doorbell rang, she was composed, her face arranged in the expression of confused grief she'd been wearing for weeks. "Sarah, dear." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes as she opened the door. "I hope you don't mind us stopping by so late. This is Mr. Chen from our legal team. We have some urgent matters to discuss." She stepped aside to let them in, noting how Chen's gaze swept the room, cataloguing exits and potential threats. Definitely not just a lawyer. "Of course. Can I get you some coffee?" "That won't be necessary." Richard settled into Marcus's favorite armchair without invitation, a deliberate power play. "We've received some concerning reports that you've been asking questions about the estate settlement, making inquiries that could complicate what should be a straightforward process." Sarah took her seat across from him, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm just trying to understand what Marcus left for the children. Surely that's natural?" "Natural, yes, but unnecessary." Chen spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a subtle accent and an unmistakable edge. "The courts have already ruled on the estate. Continuing to pursue the matter could be seen as harassment." The threat hung in the air between them. Sarah let the silence stretch, a technique she'd learned long ago. When people were uncomfortable, they revealed more than they intended. "Look, Sarah," Richard leaned forward, his tone becoming paternal. "You're a wonderful mother, but you're out of your depth here. The Holbrook holdings are complex, with obligations and debts you couldn't possibly understand. We're protecting you from that burden. And my children will be provided for naturally. The trust fund we've established will ensure they never want for anything." He pulled out a thick envelope from his coat. "In fact, we've prepared a generous settlement offer. Enough for you to start fresh somewhere new. Maybe closer to your sister in California?" Sarah stared at the envelope, understanding the full scope of their plan. They didn't just want her land, they wanted her gone entirely. Away from the community where Marcus had roots, where people might ask uncomfortable questions about the family's sudden acquisition of prime development property. "You know," she said carefully, "Marcus used to tell me stories about the family business. Some interesting tales about how certain deals got done over the years." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Chen's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his jacket, and Sarah filed that information away. Richard's face hardened, the kindly uncle mask slipping for just a moment. "Marcus had quite an imagination," Richard said. "Always did, even as a boy." Sarah stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "I'll need time to consider your offer." "Of course." Richard rose, but his smile had vanished entirely. "Just remember, Sarah, some fights aren't worth having, especially when you have so much to lose." After they left, Sarah double-checked the locks and drew the curtains. Then she returned to the safe and pulled out a different box entirely, one that contained remnants of her former life. It was time to stop being Marcus's grieving widow and remember how to be dangerous again. The rain drummed against the kitchen window as Sarah sat at her laptop, the blue glow illuminating her face in the pre-dawn darkness. Coffee had long since grown cold beside her, forgotten as she navigated through layers of digital breadcrumbs that the Kellerman family had left scattered across the internet. 3 days of methodical searching had revealed more than she'd expected. Harold's brothers weren't just greedy relatives. They were part of a systematic operation that had been targeting vulnerable widows across 3 counties. Property records showed a pattern, bereaved women losing their land within 18 months of their husbands' deaths, always to shell companies that eventually traced back to Kellerman Holdings. Her fingers paused over the keyboard as she opened another file. Margaret Kellerman, Harold's sister-in-law, had been busier than anyone realized. Bank records showed regular payments to a private investigator named Rick Torres, dating back 2 years before Harold's accident. 2 years. They'd been planning this while Harold was still alive, still working the fields, still kissing Sarah goodnight. The betrayal cut deeper than she'd thought possible. A soft creak from upstairs reminded her that Emma would be awake soon, getting ready for school. Sarah quickly screenshotted the financial records and encrypted them into a folder buried 3 layers deep on her hard drive. Old habits from her agency days. Always have backups. Always protect your intel. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Mrs. Kellerman? This is Detective Ray Morrison, County Sheriff's Department. I'd like to speak with you about some concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding your late husband's estate. Sarah's blood chilled. What kind of concerns? I'd rather discuss this in person. Would you be available this morning? I suppose. Is there something wrong? Just routine questions, ma'am. I'll be by around 9. The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, her mind racing. Someone had gotten to law enforcement first. The Kellermans were escalating, trying to paint her as the problem before she could expose their scheme. She had 3 hours. Moving quickly, Sarah gathered every document she'd collected, the forged papers, the bank records, the property transfer attempts. She made copies of everything, sealed them in waterproof bags, and hid them in 3 separate locations around the farm. The original files went into a safety deposit box she'd opened under her maiden name in the next county. By the time Detective Morrison's patrol car pulled into her driveway, Sarah had transformed herself back into the grieving widow. No makeup, Harold's old flannel shirt hanging loose over worn jeans, just vulnerable enough to seem harmless. Morrison was younger than she'd expected, probably mid-30s, with the kind of eager expression that suggested he was either very new to the job or very bad at it. He declined her offer of coffee and settled into the kitchen chair across from her with his notebook already out. Mrs. Kellerman, I've received some troubling reports about irregularities in your husband's will and some concerns about potential fraud. Fraud? Sarah widened her eyes, letting genuine shock color her voice. I don't understand. What kind of fraud? Well, there are questions about the authenticity of certain documents, and some family members have expressed concern that you might be taking advantage of their grief to manipulate the estate proceedings. Sarah almost laughed. The audacity was breathtaking. Detective Morrison, I think there's been some misunderstanding. Harold's family has been pressuring me to sign over portions of our farm, claiming Harold promised them land that was never mentioned in his actual will. I've been trying to protect my children's inheritance. She pulled out a folder, carefully selected documents that told her version of the story. These are the papers they wanted me to sign. You'll notice they're dated after Harold's death, but they claim to represent agreements made before his accident. Morrison examined the documents, his frown deepening. This does seem unusual. Detective, I loved my husband, but I barely knew his extended family. They showed up at his funeral with papers already prepared, expecting me to sign away half my children's birthright while I was still in shock. When I refused, they became increasingly aggressive. She leaned forward slightly, allowing tears to gather in her eyes. I'm scared of them. Margaret Kellerman called me yesterday and said if I didn't cooperate, they'd make sure I lost everything anyway. That's when I decided to contact my lawyer. You contacted a lawyer? Of course. Wouldn't you? My husband is dead. His family is trying to steal my children's home, and now apparently I'm being investigated for fraud because I won't roll over for them. Morrison closed his notebook, suddenly looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Kellerman, I think perhaps I should speak with these family members again. There may be some miscommunication here. After he left, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The first rule of intelligence work: control the narrative. Let your enemies think they're winning while you position your pieces on the board. But this was just the opening move. The Kellermans had resources, connections, and decades of experience intimidating grieving widows. They had no idea what they'd awakened. Sarah's hands trembled as she disconnected the call with Marcus Chen, the private investigator she'd hired 3 days ago. The manila envelope he'd couriered over contained enough evidence to make her stomach churn. Bank records, forged documents, and photographs that painted a picture of betrayal so deep it made her question everything she'd believed about her marriage to David. The kitchen felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as she spread the documents across the scarred wooden table where she'd shared countless meals with David and the children. Each piece of paper was another nail in the coffin of her old life, the life where she'd been Sarah the farmer's wife, Sarah the mother, Sarah the woman who baked pies for church fundraisers and never questioned where her husband went during his mysterious trips to town. Marcus had been thorough. Too thorough. The photographs showed David meeting with his brother Robert at the county courthouse 6 months before his death, both men emerging with satisfied expressions. Another image captured David signing papers at Robert's law office, papers that, according to Marcus's investigation, had quietly transferred portions of the farm's mineral rights to a shell company controlled by the Whitmore family trust. But it was the final photograph that made Sarah's blood run cold. David shaking hands with a man she recognized from the courthouse, Judge Harold Brennan, Robert's longtime golf partner. The timestamp showed the meeting occurred just 2 weeks before David's fatal heart attack. Sarah closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe. In the old days before David, before the farm, before she'd buried her past so deep she'd almost convinced herself it had never existed, she would have already been 3 steps ahead of men like Robert Whitmore. She would have had contingencies, leverage, and an exit strategy mapped out before they even knew she was coming for them. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway snapped her back to the present. Through the kitchen window, she watched a black sedan pull up beside her pickup truck. 2 men in expensive suits emerged, their movements deliberate and predatory. Sarah recognized the type immediately, corporate muscle dressed up as lawyers. She swept the documents into the envelope and slipped it beneath the loose floorboard near the pantry, a hiding spot she'd prepared weeks ago when she first sensed the walls closing in. Old habits died hard, and some skills were like riding a bicycle. You never really forgot how to stay ahead of people who wanted to destroy you. The knock on the front door was polite but insistent. Sarah smoothed her hair, wiped her palms on her jeans, and adopted the expression of confused widow she'd been perfecting for months. When she opened the door, the taller man was already pulling out his identification. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Agent Davidson, FBI Financial Crimes Division. This is Agent Torres. We'd like to ask you some questions about irregularities in your late husband's business dealings." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "I'm not sure how I can help you. David handled all the business matters. I mostly just worry about the kids and the day-to-day farming operations." Agent Davidson's smile was thin and unconvincing. "May we come in? This might take a while." She led them to the living room, noting how their eyes catalogued every detail. The family photographs on the mantel, the children's school awards, the modest furniture that suggested a family living paycheck to paycheck rather than sitting on millions in mineral wealth. Sarah perched on the edge of David's old recliner, wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself. "We're investigating possible fraud related to mineral rights transfers," Torres began, consulting his notepad with theatrical precision. "It appears your husband may have been involved in some questionable transactions shortly before his death." "Fraud?" Sarah injected just the right amount of shock into her voice. "That's impossible. David was the most honest man I've ever known." Davidson leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, we have reason to believe someone may have been coercing your husband into these transactions. If that's the case, you and your children could be entitled to significant compensation, but we need your cooperation to build a case." Sarah recognized the game now. These weren't federal agents. Their credentials were too clean, their questions too specific to the Whitmore family's interests. Robert had sent them to gauge what she knew and how much of a threat she posed to his carefully constructed plans. "I want to help," she said, allowing a tremor to creep into her voice. "But I honestly don't know anything about mineral rights or business transactions. David protected me from all that. Maybe you should talk to his brother Robert? They were in business together." The agents exchanged a glance that confirmed Sarah's suspicions. They were fishing, hoping she'd reveal how much Marcus had uncovered. But they were dealing with someone who'd learned long ago that information was the most powerful weapon you could wield, and the most dangerous one you could surrender. After they left, Sarah retrieved the envelope and spread the documents out again. This time, she wasn't looking at evidence of betrayal. She was studying a battle plan. The manila envelope sat heavy in Sarah's hands as she drove back from the courthouse, Marcus's words echoing in her mind. They're accelerating their timeline. The forged documents inside the envelope were masterfully crafted, close enough to fool a casual inspection, but she'd spotted the subtle inconsistencies that would unravel in court. The question was whether she'd have enough time to expose them. Her phone buzzed against the dashboard. Emma's name flashed on the screen. "Mom, something weird happened at school today." Emma's voice carried an edge that made Sarah's stomach clench. "This man came to the office asking questions about us, about where we live, what our routine is like." Sarah's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. I wasn't even supposed to know about it, but Mrs. Henderson pulled me aside to warn me. She said the man claimed to be from some family services agency, but his credentials didn't look right to her." The Hartwell family was escalating beyond legal maneuvers. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. They were either gathering intelligence for their custody play or something far worse. "Where are you now?" "Still at school. Jake's here too. We were waiting for you. Stay exactly where you are. Don't leave with anyone except me. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Sarah made a sharp U-turn, her training from years ago flooding back. She checked her mirrors methodically, noting every vehicle, every potential tail. A dark sedan had been behind her since the courthouse, maintaining just enough distance to seem coincidental. When she turned, it turned. When she accelerated, it matched her pace. She pulled into the school parking lot and watched the sedan cruise past without stopping. The driver kept his face turned away, but she caught a glimpse of his profile. Angular features, professional bearing. Not local law enforcement. Emma and Jake emerged from the building together, their usual teenage swagger replaced by nervous alertness. Sarah's heart ached, seeing how quickly their world had shifted from normal to dangerous. "Get in. We're not going straight home." As they drove, Sarah explained what she'd learned about the forged documents, watching their faces in the rearview mirror. Emma's jaw tightened with anger, while Jake's expression grew distant, processing. "So they're trying to steal the farm and take us away from you?" Emma's voice cracked slightly. "They're trying, but we're not going to let that happen." Sarah took a circuitous route home, doubling back twice to ensure they weren't followed. The familiar weight of hypervigilance settled over her like an old coat, exhausting but necessary. She'd hoped never to feel this way again, but the skills remained sharp despite years of disuse. At the farmhouse, Sarah gathered her children in the kitchen. "I need you both to listen carefully. Things are going to get more intense before they get better. The people we're dealing with have resources and they're willing to use them." "What kind of resources?" Jake asked. Sarah hesitated, then decided they deserved the truth. "Money, connections, people willing to bend rules or worse." Emma leaned forward. "Mom, what aren't you telling us about yourself?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah looked at her children, really looked at them. Emma with David's stubborn chin and her own calculating eyes. Jake with his father's gentle nature, but an underlying steel that reminded her of herself at that age. They were old enough to handle more truth, even if not all of it. "Before I met your father, I worked for the government. I can't tell you everything, but I learned skills that are useful in situations like this." "What kind of skills?" Emma pressed. "The kind that keep people safe. The kind that help you see through lies and stay ahead of threats." Jake's eyes widened. "Like a spy?" "Something like that." Sarah moved to the window, scanning the tree line out of habit. "Right now, those skills are the only advantage we have." Her phone rang. Marcus again. "Sarah, we have a problem. Judge Morrison just signed an emergency order for a welfare check on your children. Child services will be at your house within the hour." Sarah's blood turned cold. On what grounds? Anonymous tip claiming the children are in an unsafe environment. It's obviously orchestrated, but the order is legitimate. She thought fast. The timing wasn't coincidental. They'd filed the forged documents and called in the welfare check simultaneously, creating chaos from multiple directions. Can you stall them? I'm trying, but Sarah, if they find any reason to remove the kids, even temporarily, it'll strengthen the custody petition. After hanging up, Sarah turned to her children. Their faces reflected the gravity they'd heard in her voice. We have company coming. Child services. They're going to try to find reasons to take you away from me. Emma stood straighter. What do we do? Sarah felt a familiar calm descend. The clarity that came when all pretense fell away and only survival mattered. We show them exactly what they expect to see. A grieving widow and her well-adjusted children living peacefully on their family farm. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the documents spread across her kitchen table. The forged will, the falsified property transfers, the web of shell companies. Everything Marcus had uncovered painted a picture of betrayal that went back years. Her late husband's family hadn't just waited for him to die to steal her land. They'd been planning this theft while he was still alive. The burn phone buzzed against the wooden surface. Marcus again. The hearing's been moved up. His voice crackled through the speaker. Tomorrow morning. Judge Hartwell's docket. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Hartwell. But he's in their pocket. I know. Marcus's breathing was heavy, like he was walking fast. Sarah, they're moving faster than we anticipated. My contact at the courthouse says there's already a preliminary injunction drafted. If this goes through tomorrow, you'll be legally barred from the property by end of week. She closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of tactical thinking settle over her mind like an old coat. This was acceleration under pressure, a forced timeline designed to prevent adequate response. Classic manipulation technique. Where are you now? She asked. Driving back from the city. I've got copies of everything, but Sarah... His voice dropped. Someone followed me from the records office. Black sedan, government plates. The kitchen suddenly felt too exposed. Sarah moved to the window, keeping to the side as she peered through the curtain. The driveway was empty, but the tree line beyond offered too many hiding spots. How long until you're back? 20 minutes, maybe less. 20 minutes felt like a lifetime. Sarah gathered the documents, her movements efficient and practiced. The old training was surfacing now, muscle memory from a life she'd tried to bury. Document security, threat assessment, contingency planning. She'd been naive to think this would stay simple. The false wall behind the pantry gave way with a soft click. Inside the hidden compartment, wrapped in oilcloth, was a life she'd promised David she'd never touch again. But David was gone, and his family was stealing from their children. Her fingers found the Glock first, still perfectly maintained despite years of storage. Then the passports, 3 different identities, all clean, all valid. Finally, the satellite phone, military-grade, untraceable. As she assembled the weapon with practiced efficiency, Sarah's mind was already working through scenarios. If they'd escalated to surveillance, to rushing the legal proceedings, it meant they were worried. Worried people made mistakes. The sound of gravel crunching under tires made her freeze. Too early for Marcus. She moved to the front window, weapon low but ready. A silver pickup truck pulled up, one she recognized. Her brother-in-law Thomas stepped out, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. He wasn't alone. 2 men in dark clothing remained in the vehicle. Sarah's training kicked into overdrive. This wasn't a social call. The knock on the door was firm, authoritative. Sarah, it's Thomas. We need to talk. She kept her voice level, grateful for the years of practice. Kind of late for visiting, don't you think? This won't take long. It's about tomorrow's hearing. Through the peephole, she could see Thomas's face clearly. He looked confident, almost smug. Behind him, one of the men from the truck had positioned himself with a clear view of the kitchen windows. I'm listening, she called through the door. We want to make this easy for everyone involved, especially the kids. His tone carried a threat wrapped in false concern. There's no reason this has to get messy. Sarah's grip tightened on the Glock. What exactly are you proposing? A settlement. We'll give you enough to relocate comfortably. Start fresh somewhere else. The children will still have their inheritance, just in a different form. The lies came so smoothly, she almost admired the performance. Almost. And if I refuse? Thomas was quiet for a moment. Sarah, you're a smart woman, but you're out of your depth here. This thing is bigger than you realize. There are people involved who don't appreciate complications. The threat was clear now. Sarah felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest, the same feeling she'd had in Belgrade, in Somalia, in a dozen other places where survival meant making hard choices. I need time to think, she said. You have until tomorrow morning. After that, things get difficult for everyone. She watched through the peephole as they climbed back into the truck and drove away. Only when the taillights disappeared did she allow herself to breathe normally. Her phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. Nice property you have here. Be a shame if something happened to it, or to those kids of yours. Sarah stared at the screen, something cold and dangerous unfurling in her chest. They'd just made their biggest mistake. She'd been thinking like a widow, like a victim. But she wasn't either of those things. She was a mother protecting her children, and she had skills these small-town criminals couldn't even imagine. The war was about to begin. The barn creaked in the wind as Sarah crouched behind the hay bales, her fingers steady on the rifle Marcus had left behind. Through the gaps in the weathered wood, she watched 3 figures approach the farmhouse. 2 she recognized as Richard's hired men, and a third whose silhouette made her blood run cold. Vincent Carver walked with the same predatory grace she remembered from 15 years ago, when she'd been someone else entirely. Her burner phone buzzed softly. A text from Marcus, sheriff's debt compromised. Richards has contacts inside. You're on your own for now. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of her old life settling back onto her shoulders, like a heavy coat she'd never wanted to wear again. The woman who'd learned to disappear, to fight, to survive in ways that left scars on her soul, that woman had been buried the day she'd met Tom, but some things never truly died. The men split up, Carver heading toward the barn while the other 2 circled the house. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, her mind mapping escape routes and calculating angles. She'd chosen this position deliberately. 3 exits, clear sightlines, and Tom's old hunting blind accessible through the back wall if things went sideways. Carver's footsteps crunched on gravel outside. She could hear him talking quietly into a radio. No sign of the vehicle. Check the fields, she might have run. Through a crack in the barn door, Sarah saw him pause, his head tilted like a hunting dog catching a scent. Vincent had always been good at reading scenes, at sensing when prey was closer than it appeared. It's what had made him so dangerous back when they'd worked the same dark corners of the world. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was Elena, found the insurance policy documentation. Hidden account in Cayman Islands. Richard's been siphoning money for years. Also found something else. Hospital records from your kids' accidents. They weren't accidents. Sarah's grip tightened on the rifle. The broken arm Jake had gotten falling from his bike last year. Emma's concussion from slipping on the porch steps, warning shots, escalation, Richard's way of applying pressure without her realizing it was intentional. The rage that surged through her was cold and focused, nothing like the hot anger she'd felt discovering the land grab. This was the fury of a mother who'd watched her children suffer while being blind to the true cause. This was the anger that had once made her very good at a very dangerous job. Carver pushed open the barn door, his weapon drawn but not raised, overconfident. Some things never changed. "Sarah Chen," he called softly. "Or do you still prefer Agent Nightingale?" She remained perfectly still. The old code name hung in the air like smoke from a fire she'd thought was extinguished. "I know you're here. Your body language always gave you away when you were cornered. Remember Prague? You did that same thing. Went to ground instead of running." His voice carried a note of professional admiration. Richard paid very well for information about his dear sister-in-law. Imagine my surprise when I realized sweet little farm widow Sarah was actually the ghost who'd made my life so difficult a decade ago. He moved deeper into the barn, his steps careful but not careful enough. Years of soft corporate work had dulled his edge. Those children of yours, he continued conversationally, beautiful kids. Be a shame if their accidents became more permanent. Sarah moved like water, rising from behind the hay bales in one fluid motion. The rifle butt connected with Carver's temple before he could turn fully around. He dropped hard, his weapon skittering across the barn floor. She zip-tied his wrists and ankles with practiced efficiency, then dragged him behind the old tractor where the shadows were deepest. When he came to, he'd find himself looking down the barrel of his own gun. "Tell me about Richard's timeline," she said quietly when his eyes finally focused. "How long has this been planned?" Carver laughed, blood trickling from his split scalp. "Since before you married into the family." Tom never knew, but Richard had him investigated the moment he started talking about his new girlfriend. When that investigation led back to you, well, let's just say it changed the whole game plan. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. Tom's accident. Brake lines don't cut themselves. Carver's smile was all teeth, but that was supposed to be the end of it. Quick inheritance, quiet buyout, everyone moves on. You staying and fighting back? That wasn't in the plan. The barn door creaked again. Through the gaps, Sarah could see the other two men returning from their circuit of the house. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from her children, probably wondering why she wasn't answering. Everything she'd built, everyone she loved, hung in the balance of the next few hours. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m. when Sarah pulled into the abandoned gas station 12 miles outside Millbrook. Her hands trembled slightly as she cut the engine, adrenaline still coursing through her veins from the narrow escape at the Hartwell property. The manila envelope containing Marcus's real will sat on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. She'd barely made it out before Vernon's security team arrived. The sound of their vehicles crunching over gravel had sent her scrambling through Marcus's old study window, clutching the evidence that would change everything. But now what? The local sheriff was in the Hartwell pocket, and Judge Morrison had already proven his loyalty lay with whoever paid him best. Her burner phone buzzed. Unknown number. Sarah Chen. She used her maiden name deliberately, a signal to anyone from her former life. Magpie. The voice was gravelly, familiar. Heard you might need some help with a property dispute. Danny Kozlov, her old handler from the Treasury Department's undercover division, the man who'd taught her to disappear into covers so deep she sometimes forgot her real name. She hadn't spoken to him in 8 years. How did you... Your digital footprint lit up like Christmas when you started digging into those bank records. Sloppy for someone with your training. His tone carried both criticism and affection. Meet me at the old railroad bridge in 20 minutes. Come alone. The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, her carefully constructed widow's life suddenly feeling as fragile as morning frost. Danny's appearance meant someone with serious resources was tracking her activities. The question was whether that someone was friend or enemy. She drove through empty streets, past houses where honest families slept peacefully, unaware that their neighbor was about to drag shadows from a buried past into their quiet town. The railroad bridge loomed ahead, moonlight casting skeletal patterns through its iron framework. Danny waited in the shadows, looking older but still carrying himself with the predatory stillness she remembered. His silver hair was cropped military short, and his eyes held the same calculating intelligence that had made him legendary in their circles. 8 years, he said without preamble. Thought you were done with all this. I thought so too. Sarah kept her distance, instincts warning her that even old allies could be dangerous. Marcus Hartwell was supposed to be my exit strategy. Small-town farmer, simple life. Raise my kids in peace. Marcus Hartwell was dirty. The words hit like a physical blow. What? Danny pulled out a tablet, swiped through several documents, real estate money laundering primarily. His family's been washing cartel cash through land acquisitions for 15 years. Your husband was the front man, clean record, respected in the community, perfect cover. Sarah's world tilted. The man she'd loved, the father of her children, the gentle soul who'd convinced her to leave the shadows behind. All of it a lie? That's impossible. Marcus figured it out 6 months before he died. Danny's voice softened slightly. That will you found? He was trying to protect you and the kids, get you clear before his family could drag you down with them. His death wasn't an accident, Sarah. The manila envelope crinkled in her grip. Murder. She'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed made her chest tighten with rage and grief in equal measure. Who? Working theory is Vernon. Marcus was going to expose the whole operation to cut a deal with federal prosecutors. Had to be stopped. You have proof? Enough to open an investigation, but not enough to guarantee convictions. These people are connected, judges, police, state representatives. Taking them down will require more than evidence. It'll require someone willing to get her hands dirty. Sarah understood. They wanted her to go undercover again, to infiltrate the Hartwell organization from the inside, using her position as Marcus's widow, to risk everything she'd built for her children. There's something else. Danny hesitated. Your cover identity, Sarah Hartwell, widowed farmer, it's been compromised. Someone's been asking questions about your past, digging into records that should be sealed. You're blown, which means you and your kids are in immediate danger. The night air suddenly felt colder. Who's asking questions? Still tracking that down. But whoever it is has resources and federal-level access. His expression was grim. You can't go home, Sarah. Not tonight, maybe not ever. The woman who married Marcus Hartwell effectively died the moment you opened that safe. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her children's future pressing down on her shoulders. Emma and Jake, sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that their mother was about to disappear into the darkness again. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. It was survival. When she opened her eyes, the grieving widow was gone. In her place stood the operative who'd spent 5 years dismantling criminal organizations from within, who'd learned to kill without hesitation and lie without conscience. What's the plan? Danny smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. The abandoned grain silo stood like a skeletal finger against the dawn sky, its rusted metal skin catching the first pale light. Sarah crouched behind her truck, watching the building through binoculars. 3 vehicles were parked near the entrance. Marcus's black SUV, a white sedan she didn't recognize, and an old pickup that belonged to one of the hired hands who'd been feeding information to the Weatherby family. Her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Rodriguez, backup en route. ETA 20 minutes. Do not engage until we arrive. Sarah pocketed the phone without responding. 20 minutes might be too late. Through the binoculars, she could see movement in the silo's upper windows. They were definitely inside, probably destroying whatever evidence remained of their scheme to forge the mineral rights documents. She thought of Emma and Jake, safely tucked away at her sister's house 3 counties over. They didn't know the full extent of what their uncle's family had planned, how the Weatherbys intended not just to steal the land, but to fabricate evidence that would paint Sarah as an unfit mother. The custody papers she'd found in Marcus's office had been clear enough. They wanted everything, including her children. The skills she'd hoped never to use again whispered at the edges of her consciousness. 12 years of farming had softened her, made her almost forget the woman she'd been before she met David. But muscle memory was a stubborn thing, and desperation had a way of sharpening old instincts. Sarah pulled the tactical vest from her truck bed, a relic from her previous life that she'd kept hidden in the barn's false bottom. The weight of it felt both foreign and familiar as she strapped it on. Her service weapon, officially decommissioned but meticulously maintained, settled into her shoulder holster like it had never left. She approached the silo from the east, using the morning shadows and scattered equipment as cover. The building's foundation was poured concrete, but years of neglect had created gaps where the metal walls had pulled away. She pressed herself against the cold surface and listened. Told you to be more careful with those files. Marcus's voice carried through a crack near her ear. If the state auditor had seen the discrepancies, the auditor won't be a problem anymore, another voice replied. Sarah recognized it as Clayton Weatherby, David's cousin who worked at the county clerk's office. I've replaced all the original surveys with our versions. As far as the official record shows, those mineral rights have been in the family trust since 1987. What about Sarah? She's not backing down like we expected. Phase 2 takes care of that problem. The third voice belonged to a woman Sarah couldn't identify. The psychological evaluation will show she's mentally unstable, possibly dangerous to the children. Grief can do terrible things to a person's mind. Sarah's jaw tightened. They had it all planned out. Steal the land, take her children, and paint her as a madwoman in the process. The elaborate cruelty of it took her breath away. She circled to the main entrance, noting the way they'd positioned their vehicles, quick escape routes, probably armed inside. These weren't amateurs stumbling through a family dispute. This was organized, methodical, the kind of scheme that required months of planning and insider knowledge. The metal door hung slightly ajar. Sarah tested it carefully, wincing at the faint creak as it swung wider. She slipped inside, keeping low. The silo's interior stretched up into shadows, with a rickety wooden staircase spiraling along the curved wall to reach the upper level where the voices continued their conversation. Cardboard boxes lined the lower floor, filled with papers. She recognized some of them. Documents that had disappeared from David's office after his funeral. Files that Marcus had claimed were lost. A marriage certificate, David's will, surveyor reports, mineral rights transfers, the real ones, not the forgeries they'd submitted to the court. Sarah's been asking too many questions, Marcus was saying above her. Maybe it's time for another accident in the family. The words hit her like ice water. Another accident. David's death hadn't been random. The brake failure, the curve he'd driven thousands of times, the timing just weeks after he'd discovered the mineral survey that proved their land was worth millions. Sarah's breathing steadied into the rhythm she remembered from operations that seemed like someone else's lifetime. The grief and confusion that had clouded her thinking for months burned away, replaced by crystalline clarity. She began climbing the stairs, testing each step for sound. The weapon felt natural in her hand now, no longer a weight but an extension of her will. She'd tried to be the woman David had fallen in love with, the farmer, the mother, the grieving widow who played by the rules and trusted the system. But the system was rigged, and playing by the rules had cost her everything. At the landing, she paused outside the door where the voices continued their planning. Through the gap beneath it, she could see the shadows of their feet. It was time to remind the Weatherby family exactly who they'd chosen to cross. The courthouse steps were slick with morning dew as Sarah clutched the manila envelope containing the final piece of evidence that would either save her farm or destroy everything she'd fought for. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus's confrontation, and the Blackwood family had escalated their legal assault with terrifying precision. Inside the courthouse, Judge Patricia Hamilton reviewed the documents spread across her mahogany desk. Sarah sat rigidly in the plaintiff's chair, flanking her attorney, David Chen, while across the aisle, Marcus Blackwood commanded a small army of expensive suits. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows that seemed to divide the courtroom into territories of light and darkness. "Mrs. Blackwood," Judge Hamilton began, her voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench, "your petition claims fraudulent transfer of property and seeks immediate seizure of the contested farmland. That's a serious allegation." Sarah's pulse quickened. She'd anticipated this moment, but the reality of potentially losing everything in a single hearing made her stomach clench. Marcus leaned forward, his confident smile never wavering. "Your Honor," Marcus's lead attorney began, "the evidence clearly shows that Thomas Blackwood was not of sound mind when he transferred ownership to Mrs. Blackwood. Medical records indicate he was under significant medication for pain management, which impaired his judgment. The medical records were fabricated, Sarah knew this with certainty. During her surveillance of Dr. Morrison's office, she'd discovered the physician had been pressured to alter Thomas's files posthumously, but proving it was another matter entirely. Chen stood, adjusting his glasses. "Your Honor, we have counter-evidence that Mr. Thomas Blackwood was entirely lucid and acting with clear intent when he transferred the property. Furthermore, we have documentation showing the contested land was purchased with Mrs. Blackwood's own inheritance money, making her the rightful owner regardless of the transfer." This was their first line of defense, but Sarah knew it wouldn't be enough. The Blackwoods had spent months crafting their narrative, and they'd covered most of their tracks expertly. Marcus whispered something to his attorney, who nodded and stood. "Your Honor, we also have witness testimony that Mrs. Blackwood threatened Mr. Blackwood into making the transfer. We have statements from family members and neighbors." Sarah's blood chilled. She recognized the names on the witness list, people Marcus had either bought or intimidated. The trap was closing around her just as she'd feared. But then Chen played their ace card. "Your Honor, if I may present new evidence that came to light just yesterday." He approached the bench with a thick folder. "We have bank records showing systematic fraud by Marcus Blackwood, including forged documents and bribery payments to potential witnesses." The folder contained copies of the financial records Sarah had obtained through her midnight break-in at Marcus's office. She'd photographed everything, the payoffs to witnesses, the payments to Dr. Morrison, even communications with corrupt county officials who'd helped expedite the legal proceedings. Marcus's composure cracked for the first time. His eyes darted between his lawyers, and Sarah caught the flash of panic before he masked it again. Judge Hamilton studied the documents for several long minutes, while the courtroom remained silent except for the soft whisper of turning pages. Sarah's hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Finally, the judge looked up. "These are serious allegations on both sides. Mr. Blackwood, can you explain these financial transactions?" Marcus stood slowly, his jaw tight. "Your Honor, those documents were obtained illegally. They should be inadmissible." "Perhaps," Judge Hamilton replied. "But they raise questions that demand investigation. I'm ordering a full forensic audit of all parties' financial records related to this case. Additionally, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order preventing any further action on the property until this matter is resolved." It was a temporary victory, but Sarah knew Marcus wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. As the court session ended and people began filing out, Marcus caught her arm in the hallway. "You think you're clever," he hissed, his grip tight enough to bruise. "But you have no idea what you're dealing with. This family has survived worse than one desperate widow." Sarah looked him directly in the eyes, letting him see something she'd kept carefully hidden for years, the cold calculation of someone who'd faced down far more dangerous enemies than him. "Neither do you," she replied quietly, pulling free from his grip. Walking toward the courthouse exit, Sarah felt the weight of the next phase settling on her shoulders. The legal battle would continue, but she knew Marcus would escalate beyond courtrooms and paperwork. He'd shown his desperation today, and desperate men made dangerous choices. Outside, the morning had warmed into a crisp autumn day. Sarah's children were waiting in the truck, their faces anxious but trusting. She'd bought them more time, but the war was far from over. The warehouse smelled of rust and diesel fuel, its cavernous interior broken only by shafts of morning light cutting through grimy windows. Sarah crouched behind a stack of shipping containers, watching Marcus pace near the center of the building while speaking into his phone. His voice echoed off the concrete walls, confirming what she'd suspected. The Hartwell family wasn't working alone. "The judge signed off this morning," Marcus was saying. "By noon, the property will be in probate court, and she'll be out of options." Sarah's jaw tightened. Judge Morrison had been in their pocket all along, the same man who'd presided over Tom's will reading, who'd smiled sympathetically while processing the fraudulent documents. She pulled the recording device from her jacket, ensuring it captured every word. "What about the woman herself?" The voice on the other end was tinny but audible. Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. Sarah, she's finished. My brother was always too soft, keeping her in the dark about the land's real value. $3 million in mineral rights, and he let some farm girl play house on it for 15 years. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Tom had known, her husband had known what the land was worth and never told her. Sarah's hand trembled as she adjusted the recording device, but her resolve only hardened. The children won't be a problem, Marcus continued. Foster care, different families if possible. Can't have them growing up with ideas about inheritance. That was enough. Sarah had heard everything she needed, but rage propelled her forward. She'd planned to gather evidence and leave, but the casual cruelty with which Marcus discussed destroying her children's future ignited something primal in her. She moved with the fluid precision of her old life, muscles remembering training from decades past. The shipping containers provided perfect cover as she circled around Marcus's position. 20 feet, 15, 10. Marcus ended his call and turned just as Sarah emerged from the shadows. His face registered shock, then fear as he recognized the predatory stillness in her approach. "You," he breathed. "How did you—" "Find you? Your girlfriend Elena isn't as loyal as you think." Sarah's voice was steady, conversational even, but her eyes held the cold focus Marcus had never seen in his brother's widow. "She's quite chatty when she believes her own safety is at stake." Marcus fumbled for something in his jacket, a weapon, Sarah realized, but 15 years of dormancy hadn't erased her reflexes. She closed the distance before his hand cleared the fabric, her elbow connecting with his solar plexus in a precise strike that dropped him to his knees. "The recording will go to the FBI," she said, stepping back as Marcus gasped for air, "along with Elena's testimony and the financial records I found in your office last night. Amazing what people leave in supposedly locked safes. You can't—" Marcus wheezed, struggling to stand. "The courts—" "Judge Morrison? He'll be busy explaining his own crimes." Elena was very thorough in documenting his payments. Sarah pulled out her phone, showing him a photo of bank statements and cancelled checks. "Turns out she was planning to blackmail all of you eventually. I simply gave her a better offer." The warehouse door burst open, and Sarah tensed until she recognized the figures silhouetted against the morning light. FBI agent Jennifer Walsh led a team of federal agents inside, their weapons drawn but lowered when they saw Marcus on the ground. "Mrs. Hartwell," Agent Walsh called. "Step away from him, please." Sarah complied, moving toward the agent she'd contacted 3 days earlier, the same agent who'd been investigating the Hartwell's shell companies for money laundering long before Sarah had reached out about the land fraud. "The recording device is in my left pocket," Sarah said quietly as Walsh approached. "Everything you need is on there." As the agents moved to arrest Marcus, he looked up at Sarah with something approaching respect mixed with hatred. "Who are you really?" he demanded. "Tom's little farm wife couldn't have—" "Your mistake," Sarah interrupted, "was thinking that people can't change, can't grow beyond what they once were. Tom knew exactly who I was and who I chose to become. He protected me from my past, and now I'm protecting his children from you." Agent Walsh finished reading Marcus his rights, while other agents secured the warehouse. Sarah watched it all with detached calm, feeling a weight she'd carried for 15 years finally lifting from her shoulders. "There will be questions," Walsh warned her quietly, "about your methods, your sources. Some people are going to want to know about your background." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. Her carefully constructed, peaceful life was ending, but her children's future was secure. That was the only trade that mattered. "The children are safe?" she asked. "In protective custody until this is resolved. Which, given what you've provided, should be very soon." Sarah looked around the warehouse one last time, then walked toward the exit. Outside, her old pickup truck waited in the morning sunshine, ready to carry her home to the land that was finally, truly theirs. The courthouse steps were slick with morning frost, as Sarah clutched the manila envelope containing everything that would either save her farm or destroy what remained of her family. Detective Morrison flanked her left side, while her lawyer, Janet Chen, walked confidently ahead, her heels clicking against the concrete with military precision. "Remember," Janet whispered as they approached the heavy oak doors, "let me do the talking. Your job is to stay calm and let the evidence speak." Sarah nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. Inside that envelope were photographs Marcus had taken, financial records Thomas had stupidly left in his safe, and, most damning of all, the recorded confession she'd extracted from Eleanor 3 nights ago. The old woman had broken completely once Sarah revealed she knew about the forged will, spilling secrets that went back decades. The courtroom was already packed when they entered. Thomas sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit unable to mask the hollow look in his eyes. His lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Kellerman, was frantically shuffling papers. Behind them, Sarah spotted several members of the Whitmore extended family, their faces a mixture of anger and fear. Judge Patricia Hendricks called the court to order, her voice cutting through the murmur of whispered conversations. Sarah had researched the judge thoroughly, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for despising fraud and protecting family farms from corporate predators. "Your Honor," Janet began, standing with practiced grace, "we're here today because the Whitmore family attempted to orchestrate one of the most elaborate land theft schemes this county has ever seen. They forged documents, manipulated a grieving widow, and when that wasn't enough, they resorted to intimidation and violence." Kellerman objected, but Judge Hendricks waved him down. "I'll hear the evidence, Counselor. Proceed." What followed was a methodical destruction of everything Thomas and his family had built. Janet presented the financial records showing suspicious payments to county officials, including the clerk who'd initially validated the forged will. She displayed photographs of Thomas meeting with developers, signing preliminary agreements for Sarah's land, while she was still fighting the legal battle. But the moment that changed everything was when Janet played Eleanor's recorded confession. The old woman's voice filled the courtroom, brittle and defeated. "We knew the will was fake from the beginning. Thomas had it made by some forger in the city. Richard never would have left the farm to anyone but Sarah and the children, but Thomas convinced us it was ours by right, that Sarah was just some outsider who'd stolen our family legacy." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Sarah watched Thomas's face crumble as his grandmother's words condemned him completely. The recording continued, and when she started fighting back, when she hired that investigator, Thomas got desperate. He hired those men to scare her, maybe hurt her enough that she'd just give up and leave town. I told him it was going too far, but he wouldn't listen. He said she was more dangerous than we thought, that she had some kind of military background we hadn't known about. Judge Hendricks leaned forward, her expression darkening. "Are you telling me, Mrs. Whitmore, that your grandson orchestrated attacks on a widow and her children to steal their property?" Eleanor's voice cracked through the speakers. "Yes, Your Honor. God help us, yes." The courtroom erupted. Thomas shot to his feet, pointing accusingly at Sarah. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. She's not some innocent farm wife. She killed those men. She's a trained killer." "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Hendricks snapped, "you will sit down and remain silent." But Thomas was beyond rational thought. "She tortured information out of my grandmother. Look at her. Does she look like someone who learned that from farming?" Sarah felt every eye in the courtroom turn to her. For a moment, she was back in Afghanistan, making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. But then she thought of Emma and Jake, sitting in school right now, trusting her to save their home. She stood slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd commanded respect in life-or-death situations. "Your Honor, I served my country with distinction for 8 years. When I came home, all I wanted was a quiet life raising my children on the farm my husband left us. Everything I've done has been to protect my family from people who thought they could steal from a grieving widow with impunity." Judge Hendricks studied Sarah for a long moment, then turned back to Thomas. "Mr. Whitmore, based on the evidence presented and your own admissions in open court, I'm not only ruling in favor of Mrs. Whitmore, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into criminal conspiracy charges." The gavel came down with finality that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Sarah felt her knees go weak as Janet gripped her arm, whispering congratulations. Around them, the Whitmore family sat in stunned silence as bailiffs moved toward Thomas. Sarah knew this wasn't over. Men like Thomas didn't accept defeat gracefully, and desperate people made dangerous choices. She'd won this battle, but the war for her family's safety might just be beginning. The courthouse steps felt like concrete ice beneath Margaret's worn boots as she climbed toward what might be her final battle. 6 months of careful planning, of gathering evidence and turning enemies into allies, had led to this moment. The leather satchel in her hands contained everything: bank records, forged documents, recorded conversations, and photographs that would either save her farm or seal her fate. Detective Rodriguez waited by the entrance, his expression grim. "They're all here," he said quietly. "The whole family, plus their lawyers. 3 of them." Margaret nodded, her pulse steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. The skills she'd buried 20 years ago, patience, calculation, the ability to read people's weaknesses, had served her well these past months. Thomas's family had underestimated the quiet farm widow, and that mistake would cost them everything. Inside the courtroom, she took her seat at the plaintiff's table beside her attorney, Sarah Chen, a sharp young lawyer who'd taken the case pro bono after seeing the evidence Margaret had compiled. Across the aisle, the Hartwell family sat in expensive suits, their confidence palpable. Richard, the patriarch who'd orchestrated the land grab, his sons Michael and David, who'd forged the loan documents. Even Thomas's sister Patricia was there, the one who'd pretended to comfort Margaret while secretly copying keys to her home. Judge Morrison entered, and the room fell silent. Margaret's children, Emma and Jake, sat in the gallery behind her, their faces tense with hope and fear. Everything their father had left them hung in the balance. "Your Honor," Sarah began, rising with practiced grace, "what we have here is a systematic campaign of fraud and conspiracy. The defendants exploited my client's grief to steal land worth $12 million using forged documents and false pretenses." Richard Hartwell's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Brennan, countered smoothly. "Your Honor, my clients are the victims here. They generously helped Mrs. Hartwell through financial difficulties, providing legitimate loans secured by property that rightfully belongs to the Hartwell Family Trust." Margaret watched the legal dance unfold, but her attention was on Richard himself. She'd studied him for months, learning his tells, his weaknesses, the way he touched his wedding ring when lying, the slight twitch in his left eye when cornered. Both were happening now as Sarah methodically presented the evidence. The forged loan documents came first, with a handwriting expert explaining the subtle differences between Thomas's genuine signature and the fabricated ones. Then came the bank records, showing suspicious transfers between Hartwell family accounts in the days before Thomas's death. Margaret had obtained those through channels she preferred not to think about. Favors called in from her old life, skills that came back like riding a bicycle. But the real bombshell was the recorded conversation between Richard and Michael, discussing how to accelerate the foreclosure process. Margaret had planted the device during a family dinner she'd hosted, playing the grieving widow while gathering evidence of their conspiracy. The audio quality was crystal clear as Richard's voice filled the courtroom. "She's too broken to fight. We'll have everything within 6 months." Patricia's face went white as the recording played. She'd been the one to suggest that family dinner, to help Margaret reconnect with Thomas's relatives. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "Your Honor," Brennan interjected desperately, "this recording was obtained illegally without consent." "In a one-party consent state," Sarah countered, "where Mrs. Hartwell was present for the conversation in her own home." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. She'd researched the recording laws extensively before planting that device. The coup de grace came with Detective Rodriguez's testimony about the safety deposit box, the one registered under Thomas's name but accessed repeatedly by Richard using a forged power of attorney. Inside, they'd found the original family trust documents, the real ones, not the altered versions the Hartwells had filed. Documents that clearly showed Thomas's children as primary beneficiaries, with no mention of the debts Richard claimed existed. As the evidence mounted, Margaret watched the family's confidence crumble. Michael whispered urgently with his lawyer. David's hands shook as he reached for water. Patricia stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes, but Richard remained defiant even as his empire collapsed around him. "Mrs. Hartwell," Judge Morrison said finally, "I want to commend you on your thoroughness in gathering this evidence. It's clear that a grave injustice was attempted here." The judge's words continued, but Margaret's mind drifted to Thomas. He would have been proud, she thought, not of the deception and manipulation, he'd always been too good for such things, but of her fighting spirit, of her refusal to let their children be robbed of their inheritance. When the gavel fell, it was over. Complete restitution ordered, criminal referrals filed. The farm was theirs again, along with substantial damages for their suffering. But as Margaret packed her satchel, she knew this victory came with a price. She'd awakened parts of herself she'd thought buried forever, and some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Sarah adjusted her blazer and checked her watch. Inside her purse, the flash drive containing Marcus's financial records felt heavier than its actual weight. 3 weeks had passed since that confrontation in the barn, and today would determine whether her children kept their inheritance or lost everything to the Blackwood family's greed. Detective Morrison approached from across the street, his expression grim but determined. "The DA's ready," he said quietly. "Marcus's confession about the forged documents was enough to get the warrants. We found everything: offshore accounts, bribery records, even communications with the judge who ruled against you initially." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "And Judge Harrison. Suspended pending investigation. Turns out the Blackwoods have been buying favorable rulings for years." Morrison's jaw clenched. "Your case was just the latest in a long line of corruption." They climbed the courthouse steps together, each footfall echoing with the weight of justice delayed but not denied. Sarah's mind wandered briefly to her children, safely at school, unaware that their future hung in the balance of today's proceedings. Emma had asked that morning why Mummy seemed nervous, and Sarah had simply kissed her forehead and promised that everything would be okay soon. The courtroom was packed. Harold Blackwood sat with his expensive legal team, his face a mask of controlled fury. Beside him, Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, a performance Sarah had seen many times before. They had no idea Marcus had betrayed them. They still believed their money and influence would prevail. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Coleman," the bailiff announced. Judge Coleman was known for her integrity, something the Blackwoods couldn't purchase. Sarah felt a flutter of hope as the proceedings began. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Catherine Wells, wasted no time presenting the evidence. Financial records flashed on screens, bank transfers revealing the systematic theft of crop revenues that should have gone to Sarah, forged signatures on documents that transferred property illegally, a paper trail of corruption that stretched back 5 years, beginning just months after David's death. Marcus testified from his plea agreement, his voice barely audible as he detailed the family's conspiracy. "Harold said she was just a farmer's wife, said she'd never figure out what we were doing." His eyes met Sarah's briefly before dropping to his hands. "We were wrong about that." Harold's attorney attempted damage control, arguing that Marcus was a disgruntled family member seeking revenge. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, recorded phone conversations, emails discussing how to handle the widow problem. Each piece of proof hammered another nail into their case. During a brief recess, Victoria cornered Sarah in the hallway. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her cultured facade finally cracking. "Even if we lose this, you'll never truly belong. You'll always be the outsider who married into our family." Sarah studied her former mother-in-law's face, seeing the desperation beneath the venom. "You're right about one thing, Victoria. I never belonged to your family." She stepped closer, her voice steady and calm. "But David did. And he chose me. He chose our children. That's what you could never forgive." When court reconvened, Judge Coleman's expression left little doubt about her feelings regarding the evidence presented. The systematic theft of assets, the fraudulent transfer of property, and the corruption of judicial proceedings represent a betrayal not just of family trust, but of the very foundations of our legal system. Harold Blackwood's empire crumbled with clinical precision. Assets frozen, properties seized, criminal charges filed. The farmland would return to Sarah and her children, along with 5 years of stolen crop revenues and substantial damages for their suffering. As the gavel fell, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd carried since David's death. The skills from her past, patience, observation, strategic thinking, had served her well, but it was love for her children that had given her the strength to fight back against seemingly impossible odds. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements, but Sarah walked past them toward her truck. Detective Morrison caught up with her at the curb. "What will you do now?" he asked. Sarah looked out across the city toward the farmland that was finally, truly hers again. "Go home, plant the spring crops, teach my children that sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing, but it's always worth fighting for." She drove home as the sun reached its zenith, ready to tell Emma and Jake that their father's legacy was secure. The woman who had once been skilled at disappearing had instead chosen to stand and fight, reclaiming not just land and money, but the future David had dreamed of for their children. The farmhouse came into view, and Sarah smiled. She was finally home.